All right, here we go. Bioenergy, starting on page 563. So bioenergy, getting energy from things that were living. Obviously, we're talking about plants, not animals and humans. Okay, that's what I got a question about last year, if we could do that. And I said, well, potentially, but that's not what we're doing for sure. So getting energy from things that were living, this potentially can be carbon neutral, meaning that like a plant is getting all the carbon it needs to grow itself from the atmosphere, and basically we're just burning it and putting it back into the atmosphere. So that's what carbon neutral means. So you can use wood, you can use charcoal, you can use manure to do the same thing. Okay, this chart up here, 20.3, says sources and uses of energy use. There's kind of a like an outline of all the different things that it can be used for. And I'm not going to walk through all of them, but just so you guys can reference what the different biomass things can use to make bioenergy. Now moving to 564, biomass can only be considered sustainable if it's not over harvested. So, you know, like if we're doing deforestation kind of a thing, obviously biomass doesn't become sustainable because we're just wiping out the whole forest. So we need to make sure that we're doing it correctly. It also, we use waste from farms to generate electricity and biofuels. And the waste from the farms, I'm talking about like manure. You know, so instead of all that stuff just kind of running down to the Mississippi River, we capture it so we can use it. You can also add biomass to coal-burning plants to make them produce less pollution. A thing that's called co-firing. So instead of just shoveling coal into the fire, you know, dump a bunch of trees in there, stuff like that. Okay, it makes them produce, it makes them a little bit cleaner is what it does. So moving to 565, so the benefits of this, it obviously is going to alleviate climate change in many ways. So instead of basically pulling carbon from deep down underground and putting that carbon from the lithosphere back into the atmosphere, like I said earlier, biomass is basically taking the carbon from the atmosphere to make itself, and we're just putting it back into the atmosphere kind of a thing. But the drawback of this is that we're slowly going to deplete the soil quality since we're removing the waste products. And waste products are what makes soil quality. So like we watched in that movie, you know, the whole thing about dirt is basically they recycle stuff. And we think back to The Biggest Little Farm. You know, they used manure initially to do that big kind of, what they call it, the biomass tea or something like that, to basically make their soil good. They put all that stuff back into the soil. But biomass burning, we're basically pulling everything out of the soil and not replenishing it. So that's got to be kind of another step in the process. We got to replenish it. So now moving on to 566. There's things called ethanol and E85. So this helps cars burn more efficiently with less emissions, but the whole thing is corn based, and corn takes a lot of input for it to grow. You know, a lot of the tractors obviously aren't going to be running on the ethanol fuel just yet. You know, a whole bunch of fertilizer. We've talked about how fertilizer can run off and cause algal blooms. It takes a whole bunch of water. We've talked about how much water is already going into farming. And now we're going to use more to basically make it so we can have the biomass or the ethanol fuel and E85. It's also not our best option. You can see that EROI is 1.3 to 1. So we're not getting very much out of it in a cost-benefit analysis, which we talked about the EROI. I like this diagram here because it basically shows area of corn grown in the US today, and then the area of corn that would need to be grown if ethanol were to replace all the gasoline in the United States. And that whole area, they've talked about that before, this whole area here, that's basically the breadbasket of the United States and sometimes the world. So if we replaced all of that simply to run our cars, then where do we grow all of our food? So that becomes a big problem. All right, now we also got biodiesel is on 567. This is made from vegetable oil and used cooking grease and animal fat. Okay, it's biodiesel. It cuts down on emissions. It's also non-toxic and biodegradable. So, sounds pretty good. Comes from crops, which have their own negative consequences, like we talked about with the amount of tractors and water and soil depletion and all those kind of different things that come along with it. The thing I like here, this diagram, is showing basically how much better it is for the environment, or the difference between them. So The B20 is basically 20% biodiesel versus 100% biodiesel. And this is going to negative, see, percentage reduction versus petroleum, or excuse me, petrodiesel, like typical diesel. So typically, you can see the difference right there, just carbon monoxide. Bigger difference in particulate matter. Not as much of a difference in total hydrocarbons, but sulfates is huge, nitrous oxides. So using that biofuel makes it a better engine for the environment. And I like what these guys did down here at Loyola University in Chicago. They basically are taking all the waste from their college and making it so that van runs completely on just the college's waste. All right. We talked a little bit about this today. Which energy sources have the best and worst EROI? There's kind of a better diagram of what I was trying to show today. You can see hydropower is the top. Coal is the best. Then it starts going down. There's nuclear power right there. And they all kind of drop from there, just to kind of see what's going on. Now, another thing that they're talking about is algae. So instead of having like a whole bunch of land that you got to use, algae you can grow in a whole bunch of different types of water as well. So it doesn't need to be clean, fresh drinking water. You can grow algae in salt water. So the algae potential, you can make the lipids for the biofuel to make that biodiesel. You got carbs for the ethanol, that E85. It grows really fast. Like algae grows a lot faster than typical plants on land. It grows in lots of types of water, like I was just saying. The CO2 emissions actually help them because, as we all know, photosynthesis, they got to breathe in carbon dioxide. So those CO2 emissions can be used to help this. But the biggest drawback is this whole thing's expensive. Because again, it's a novel and new technology, so they need to push more and more and more energy into it, or more and more technology and research into it. So they also got a thing called cellulose ethanol. So this comes from cellulose. It's in food for humans. The EROI is obviously way better than the corn, like we were just talking about. Remember, corn was 1.3 to 1. This one's 5 to 1. Now, this whole thing, the bioenergy carbon neutral, you can kind of make the argument with both ways. And I'm going to kind of leave that open-ended because I want you guys to basically read that bioenergy carbon neutral. I want you to read this paragraph, and it's basically just this paragraph and the one to the top there, and that's it. And that's going to be our entry test tomorrow, is basically make an argument of which one it is. Then leave some questions so we got stuff to talk about.